Right, boys. So the next part of the extended speech, extended narrative, is the idea of subordinate clauses within indirect speech. So this means you have an indirect statement, and within that indirect statement, the person who's speaking adds in a subordinate clause. So you might have something like, the messenger said that the king who had killed the enemy had arrived. Okay. And the whole point is that the messenger has said both those things. He said that the king had arrived, and he's also said that the king has killed the enemy. So what that means is that he had a subordinate clause within his direct speech, so it's then transferred into his indirect speech. It cannot be part of the accusative infinitive because it's a separate clause from the accusative infinitive, from the main clause that he kind of said in the first place. So because of that, it becomes subjunctive. So if you have a relative clause, a time clause, a causal clause, a concessive clause within an indirect statement, it doesn't add another accusative infinitive, it just becomes a separate phrase with a subjunctive. And it's quite straightforward because it's tense by sense. So very kind of simple translation there to do. The only thing that makes it complicated is obviously that you've got your verb of speaking in the first place, you've then got your accusative infinitive, and then you also have this subjunctive clause. But if you translate it logically, then it will make sense. So it should be pretty easy. The only thing that makes it more complicated, well, the only things that make it more complicated are firstly these exceptions. The first one is that a subordinate clause will not be subjunctive if it's just a comment by the narrator. So if the original speaker didn't say that subordinate clause and it's just a writer adding the information in, then it needs to be indicative. So for example, instead of saying the messenger said that the king who had killed the enemy was arriving, imagine if Tacitus is writing and he says, the messenger said that the king, who I believe to have been barbaric, had arrived. And it's Tacitus who is stating that relative clause, who's saying, I believe that he's barbaric. Then it's indicative because it wasn't originally part of the speech that's now being indirectly reported. It's just a piece of information that Tacitus himself wants to add into his writing. And if that's the case, then it will be indicative rather than subjunctive. The nice thing about that, obviously, is in English, you could say that and you wouldn't know really from the grammar whether it's the messenger who said it or whether it's Tacitus who said it. Whereas in Latin, it's quite clear. If it's subjunctive, it was part of the indirect statement. If it's indicative, it's an additional piece of information that the writer is adding in. The other exception is very straightforward, just with done. Done is followed by the indicative present tense, and that is the case even if it's within an indirect statement. So it doesn't break its rules for the sake of this bit of grammar. Okay, the other little tricky thing to add is the issue that occurs when we have a hidden future perfect within a time clause. And then that time clause is put as part of a subordinate clause within an indirect statement. So because it's future perfect, it then basically keeps the perfect element of that when it goes into the subjunctive, but it kind of sacks off the future element. And the reason it can sack off the future element is because there will be a future infinitive as part of the indirect statement. So look at these two examples and hopefully that'll make sense. So just look at this first one here. We've got an indirect statement because we've got an accusative and then we've got a future infinitive. So we immediately know that whatever's being reported is something that will happen, okay? And then we have here our perfect subjunctive advenerit. Now, because this perfect subjunctive appears within an indirect statement that's in the future, we know that that subjunctive cannot just be perfect. It must be referring to what would have originally have been a future perfect if this wasn't an indirect statement. And The future perfect essentially tells us that an action happens before whatever the other verb is in a sentence. So if you were saying when he will have arrived, he will write a letter. Obviously, you wouldn't say it like that in English, but you'd say it like that in Latin. The main point is that he's doing the arriving before he's writing the letter. Okay, and that's what the future perfect does. So we've got to kind of keep that element in this sentence. So if we translated this sentence just the indirect statement and not the subordinate clause, it would say, he says that he will write to you. Okay. So then we've established that adverbs represents a future perfect because it's perfect tense, but it's followed by a future infinitive. So therefore we've got to make it happen before that infinitive. What happens before the future? The present happens before the future. So he says that he will write to you when he arrives. Okay, which obviously freaks us out a little bit because we're translating a perfect subjunctive as the present tense. But it's got to be that way because it's got to happen before the future infinitive. And it's also got to happen in line with the original verb. So because dicit is primary sequence, as I've written above there, the future perfect becomes perfect subjunctive. What happens then when the original verb is historic sequence? We have dixit say in this second sentence. So he said that he would write a letter to you. Now again, advenicet, it's become pluperfect because it was originally future perfect. But it's in a historic sequence, so it needs in the subjunctive to become pluperfect. And again, it needs to happen before the future infinitive, and the future infinitive is the clue that tells us that this verb originally would have been future perfect. But it also needs to happen in line with the historic verb dixit. Okay, so it's become pluperfect because it's historic, but we're going to translate it as perfect tense. So he said that he would write to you when he arrived. And that's because it's got to happen, again, in line with the original verb when you translate it, and it's also got to happen before the infinitive when you translate it. This is complicated, and it's really weird, and the way we're translating them kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. But the main thing to remember is if there's a future infinitive and a perfect or pluperfect subjunctive, then that subjunctive will originally have been future perfect. And if that verb will have originally been future perfect, then you're translating the perfect as the present, and you're translating the pluperfect as the perfect. So it's all a bit brain mashy, it's all a bit weird, but just remember those rules. And again, at the end of the day, it comes down to logic when you translate it as well.